Jake Thorne wiped the sweat from his forehead as the twin sons of Drakenheim began their slow descent toward the horizon. His pork farm wasn't much to look at, just 20 acres of rolling hills on the edge of human territory, but it was honest work. The kind of work that let him sleep well at night. His neighbors back on Earth used to joke that he treated his pigs better than most people treated their pets, and out here on this frontier world, nothing had changed. The evening air carried that peculiar smell of alien soil mixed with familiar barn scents. Jake had been on Drakenheim for 3 years now, long enough to stop thinking of it as a strange place. Long enough to get used to sharing a planet with the Drakari, the massive dragon-like beings who had called this world home for thousands of years before humans showed up with their colony ships and big dreams. He hauled the bucket of leftover scraps toward his compost heap behind the barn. Fat trimmings, bits of bone, gristle, the parts that weren't fit for selling at the market but too good to just throw away. The compost would break it down, turn it into rich fertilizer for the vegetable garden his wife had insisted on planting before she passed 2 years ago. He still kept it going. Felt wrong to let it die with her. That's when the shadow fell across the barn. Jake looked up and his breath caught. A Drakari was descending into his yard, wings spread wide enough to block out both moons that were just starting to rise. But this wasn't one of the massive warriors he sometimes saw flying over the valley. This one was smaller, younger. Her scales caught the last rays of sunlight, shimmering in deep blues and purples like an oil slick on water. She landed with surprising grace for a creature that had to weigh at least 800 pounds. Her claws dug into the dirt of his yard, and Jake noticed she kept her wings partially extended, like she was ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. Her head lowered, horns still short and growing, eyes bright with something that looked uncomfortably like fear. Jake set down his bucket slowly. He'd lived near the Drakari long enough to know their ways. They were proud. Fiercely independent. They hunted their own food, defended their own territories, and asking for help was about the worst shame their culture could imagine. So when this young female opened her mouth and spoke in halting, broken galactic common, Jake knew something was seriously wrong. "You have leftover meat? The parts you throw." Her voice was rough, like gravel sliding down a metal sheet. "I take? Please?" Jake blinked. In 3 years he'd never heard a Drakari say please to a human. He looked at her more carefully now. Her scales, which should have been bright and glossy on a healthy Drakari, looked dull in places. Her ribs showed just slightly under her chest plates. She wasn't starving, not yet, but she wasn't eating well either. Every instinct told him to ask questions. Why was she begging for scraps? Where was her family? What happened to her? But something in those desperate eyes stopped the words in his throat. Instead he just nodded. "Yeah, sure. Hold on." He grabbed 2 of the large feed bags from his barn and filled them with the scraps he'd been about to compost. Trimmings, fat, bits of bone with meat still clinging to them. The stuff he couldn't sell but was still perfectly good protein. He tied the bags shut and carried them over. She took them with surprising gentleness, her claws careful not to tear the material. "Thank you," she said, and there was so much genuine gratitude in those words that Jake felt something twist in his chest. She bowed her head, a formal gesture he'd seen Drakari do with each other, then launched herself into the air with powerful beats of her wings. Jake watched her fly toward the mountain range to the east, her silhouette growing smaller against the darkening sky. He stood there for a long time after she disappeared, the empty bucket still in his hand. The next evening, right around the same time, she came back. Jake was ready this time, had set aside the day's scraps and clean bags. She landed, took them with the same careful gratitude and left. No more words than necessary. The third evening, same thing. Jake found himself watching the sky, waiting for her to appear. The fourth evening he had the bags ready before she even landed. She was getting more comfortable around him, he noticed, landing a bit closer. Not keeping her wings spread for a quick escape. By the fifth evening Jake's curiosity was eating him alive. What was she doing with all this meat? Why did she need scraps when Drakari were supposed to be mighty hunters? Where did she go every night? When she took the bags and lifted into the air, Jake made a decision. He walked to his old hoverbike, the one he used to check fence lines in the far pastures, and quietly started it up. The electric motor hummed softly as he lifted off the ground. He followed her, keeping his distance, his hoverbike running on silent mode as they wound through the mountain passes. She never looked back. She had no idea he was there, trailing behind her like a ghost through the gathering darkness. Whatever she was hiding, Jake was about to find out. Jake's hoverbike hummed quietly as he followed the young Drakari through the mountain passes. The scorched peaks loomed ahead, jagged and unwelcoming against the night sky. Even from a distance he could see why they called them that. The rocks were blackened, twisted by some ancient volcanic fury that had left the whole region looking like a scar on the planet's face. Most Drakari avoided this area. Jake had heard the local warriors call it cursed, a dead place where nothing good could grow. But the Dragoness flew straight toward it, her wings cutting through the thin mountain air with steady determination. Jake kept his distance, using the rocky outcroppings for cover. His heart pounded in his chest. Part of him felt guilty for following her like this, invading her privacy. But a bigger part needed to know. Needed to understand why a Drakari was begging for scraps from a human farmer. She descended into a narrow valley hidden between two massive cliff faces. Jake landed his hoverbike on a ledge overlooking the valley and killed the engine. He crept forward on foot, staying low, until he could peer down into the basin below. What he saw hit him like a physical blow. The valley floor was dotted with crude shelters, nothing more than scraped-together pieces of rock and salvaged metal leaning against the cliff walls. And everywhere there were children. Drakari hatchlings and juveniles, dozens of them, their small forms moving in the dim light of a few scattered fires. But these weren't the proud, fierce young Drakari he'd seen in the proper settlements. These children looked broken. Their scales, which should have gleamed with health and youth, were dull and faded. Many of them were thin, so thin that Jake could see their bones pressing against their hides. Some limped. Others had scarred wings. A few of the smallest ones just sat motionless, staring at nothing with eyes that had seen too much. The Dragoness landed in the center of the camp, and the transformation was immediate. The children swarmed her like she was their whole world. They pressed close, their thin bodies crowding around her, chirping and crying in their own language. The sound of it made Jake's throat tight. It was the sound of desperate hope. She lowered her head and spoke to them gently, her voice carrying across the valley. Jake didn't understand the Drakari language, but he didn't need to. The tone said everything. She was trying to comfort them, trying to tell them it would be okay. Then she opened the bags Jake had given her. He watched from his hiding spot as she carefully, meticulously divided the scraps. Every child got a portion. She moved between them with infinite patience, making sure the smallest ones got their share, breaking up pieces for those too weak to tear the meat themselves. The children fell on the food like they hadn't eaten in days. Maybe they hadn't. What made Jake's chest ache was watching her. She kept nothing for herself. Not one scrap. She moved through the crowd of hungry children, giving away every last bit of food, even though he could see her ribs pressing through her own scales. She was starving herself to feed them. An older Drakari male approached her as she finished distributing the food. He moved with a limp, and Jake noticed with a shock that he was missing his entire left wing. Just a scarred stump remained where it should have been. The male looked ancient, his scales gray with age, his movements careful and pained. The wind shifted, carrying their voices up to Jake's position. They were speaking in Galactic Common now, probably so the children wouldn't understand. "How many tonight?" the male asked. "Enough for everyone," she replied, her voice tired. "Barely. Vera, you need to eat too. You're wasting away." So her name was Vera. Jake filed that away. "I'm fine, Clayton," she insisted. "They need it more." Clayton shook his head, his expression grim. "We can't keep doing this. We're losing them. 3 more died this week. Little Pip passed yesterday morning. Couldn't fight off the fever. Vera's whole body seemed to sag. I know. But what else can I do? No one will help us. You know what the council says. That we're unworthy," Clayton spat the word like poison. "That orphans without family lines should be left to the natural order. That it's tradition." "It's murder," Vera said quietly. Jake's hands gripped the rock he was crouching behind so hard his knuckles went white. He'd heard about the Krovar invasion. It had been all over the galactic news feed 6 months ago. A brutal attack on the eastern territories of Drakenheim by a rival species. Whole settlements burned. Thousands dead. The Drakari had eventually driven them back, but not before entire family lines were wiped out. And apparently the children left behind, the orphans, were just abandoned. Cast out. Left to die because some ancient tradition said they were unworthy without a family name. Clayton continued, his voice heavy with grief. "I've tried. I've begged every clan within flying distance. They all say the same thing. Tradition is tradition. The weak must fall so the strong can rise. They won't break the old ways, not even for hatchlings who've done nothing wrong except have their parents murdered. And that human keeps giving me scraps," Vera said. "He doesn't ask questions. Just gives me what he would throw away. He has kind eyes. One human's kindness isn't enough. We need real help. Medicine. Shelter. Food that will last. Clayton looked at the children, his old eyes sad. Winter's coming in 2 months. Half of them won't survive it. Jake had heard enough. More than enough. His mind was already racing, already planning. He backed away from the ledge carefully, not wanting to alert them to his presence. He reached his hoverbike and sat there for a moment, his hands shaking. 3 children dead this week. Half of them wouldn't survive winter. Not on his watch. Not if he had anything to say about it. Jake started his hoverbike and headed back toward his farm, but his mind was already somewhere else. He was making lists, calculating supplies, figuring out what he had and what he'd need. He'd spent 3 years on this frontier world watching Drakari and humans live separate lives, respecting each other's boundaries. Well, to hell with boundaries. Those were kids down there. That's all that mattered. By the time Jake reached his farm, the twin moons were high in the sky, and his decision was made. Tomorrow morning, everything was going to change. Jake didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those thin, hungry children huddled in their makeshift shelters. He heard Clayton's words echoing in his head, 3 more died this week. By the time the first sun rose, Jake had already been awake for 2 hours, loading his cargo hauler. Every crate of preserved meat from his cold storage. Sacks of grain he'd been saving for winter. Medical supplies from his first aid cabinet. Blankets, tarps, anything he could think of that might help. His back was aching and his hauler was packed to capacity when he heard the familiar sound of wings. Vera landed in his yard right on schedule, expecting her usual bags of scraps. Instead, she found Jake standing next to a loaded cargo hauler, arms crossed, waiting for her. "Show me where they are," Jake said. Vera's eyes went wide, her pupils contracting to slits. "What? I don't." "I followed you last night," Jake said flatly. "I saw the valley. I saw the kids. Now show me where they are, or I'll find it myself and waste half the morning doing it." Vera took a step back, her wings half spreading in agitation. "You followed me? You had no right. That's our business, our shame. You shouldn't have seen that. It's our tradition, our way." "Your tradition is letting kids starve," Jake cut her off, his voice hard as iron. "Kids who didn't do anything wrong except have their parents killed. So you can take your tradition and—" He stopped himself, took a breath. "I don't care about tradition, Vera. Those are children down there. Now, you can either show me the way or you can watch me figure it out on my own. Your choice." Vera stared at him for a long moment. Jake could see the conflict in her eyes, generations of cultural programming warring with the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, someone was finally going to help. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you care? They're not your species. They're not even your problem." Jake looked at her like she'd asked why water was wet. "They're kids. That's reason enough." Something in Vera's expression cracked. She nodded slowly. "Follow me. Stay close. The winds through the scorched peaks are dangerous if you don't know the currents." The flight took 30 minutes, and Jake's hauler groaned under the weight of supplies as it navigated the mountain passes. When they descended into the valley, every child in the camp scattered in fear at the sight of a human vehicle. Only Clayton stood his ground, his body positioned protectively between Jake and the hatchlings. Jake powered down the hauler and climbed out, hands visible and empty. "I'm here to help." Clayton's eyes narrowed. "I know you. You're the pork farmer. You've been giving Vera scraps." "Not anymore," Jake said. He gestured to the cargo hauler. "Now I'm bringing the real stuff. Food, supplies, medicine. And I'm going to teach you how to make sure you never have to beg for scraps again." Over the next week, Jake became a permanent fixture in that hidden valley. He didn't just drop off supplies and leave. He stayed. He worked. He taught. The first lesson was shelter. The crude lean-tos wouldn't survive a strong wind, let alone winter. Jake showed them how to build proper structures using the materials at hand, how to insulate walls with packed earth and dried grass, how to create spaces that would hold heat. The older children helped, learning as they went. Even some of the smallest ones carried stones, proud to be contributing. Then came water. Jake and Clayton spent 2 full days digging until they hit a decent aquifer. Jake rigged up a simple pump system using parts he'd brought and some he improvised from salvaged materials. Clean, fresh water flowing for the first time in months. The children's faces when they tasted it made every blister on Jake's hands worth it. Food was next. "You can't rely on hunting alone," Jake explained to Clayton as they worked on clearing a flat section of the valley floor. "Hunting takes energy and half these kids are too weak for it anyway. You need crops. Sustainable food sources." Clayton watched skeptically as Jake showed him how to till soil, how to plant in rows, how to rotate crops to keep the earth healthy. Drakari don't farm. We hunt. We're predators. Drakari also don't let children starve, Jake shot back. But here we are, breaking traditions. Clayton had no response to that. But Jake noticed he paid close attention to every word. The older Drakari had taken a human name, he explained, after spending time in human settlements. Clayton, he said. Easier for humans to pronounce than my birth name. Plus, I like how it sounds. Why help her? Jake asked one evening as they worked on building a storage shed. You could have left like everyone else. Clayton's expression darkened. Because I remember being young and scared. Because someone helped me once when they didn't have to. Because these children deserve better than to be abandoned for the crime of surviving. By the fourth day, word had gotten out among the human colonists. Jake had sent a few messages to friends, explaining the situation. He'd expected maybe a handful of people to care. He hadn't expected the convoy. 12 vehicles arrived at his farm, loaded with supplies and volunteers. There was Beverly, a retired doctor from the colony's main settlement. Heard you found some kids who need medical attention, she said, her medical bag already in hand. Point me at them. 2 engineers, brothers named Kyle and Raymond, showed up with water purification equipment and power generators. Can't have kids living in the dark, Kyle said simply. A teacher named Patricia brought boxes of learning materials. If they're going to rebuild their lives, they'll need education. More kept coming. Farmers, builders, medics, people who just wanted to help. Jake led them all to the hidden valley, and watched as the Drakari children's fear slowly transformed into wonder. Beverly set up a clinic in one of the newly built shelters, treating infections and malnutrition. The engineers got power running. Patricia started teaching basic skills, and to everyone's surprise, the children were eager learners. But not everyone was happy about it. On the 7th day, a Drakari warrior delegation landed in the valley. 6 of them, full-grown, armed and radiating authority. The leader, a massive male with scarlet scales, looked at the bustling camp with barely concealed disgust. What is the meaning of this? He demanded. Humans interfering in Drakari affairs? This is a violation of our cultural sovereignty. Jake stepped forward, still holding the hammer he'd been using to build beds. Your cultural sovereignty was letting kids die. I fixed that. The warrior's eyes blazed. These orphans are under the judgment of tradition. The weak must fall so the strong may rise. You have no right. They're children, Jake interrupted. That gives me every right. The confrontation had begun. And Jake had a feeling it was about to get a whole lot worse before it got better. The message came through Jake's comm device 3 days after the warrior delegation's visit. It was from Governor Mitchell, and the tone was not friendly. Get to my office. Now. Jake made the hour-long trip to the colony's main settlement, his stomach churning. He knew this was coming. You don't upset an entire alien species power structure without consequences. Governor Mitchell was a thin man with gray hair and the kind of tired eyes that came from too many years making impossible decisions. He didn't offer Jake a seat. Do you have any idea what you've done? Mitchell's voice was quiet, which was somehow worse than if he'd been yelling. The Drakari High Council has issued a formal complaint. They're calling your actions a direct violation of their cultural sovereignty. They want you arrested, the valley cleared, and those children returned to, whatever they call it, the natural order. So don't arrest me, Jake said simply. Mitchell's jaw clenched. It's not that simple. They're threatening to revoke our settlement rights. All of them. Every human on this planet gets expelled if you don't stop. Do you understand what I'm saying? You're going to start a war over a bunch of orphaned aliens. They're children, Jake said, his voice steady. And yeah, Governor, they're worth it. Every single one of them. One man's conscience isn't worth the displacement of 5,000 colonists. Jake leaned forward, his hands flat on the governor's desk. Then I guess you've got a choice to make. Because I'm not stopping. Those kids are staying in that valley, fed and safe, whether you back me or not. Mitchell stared at him for a long moment. You're going to force my hand, aren't you? I'm not forcing anything. I'm just not abandoning children to die. If that's controversial, then maybe we need to take a hard look at ourselves. Jake left before Mitchell could respond. He knew the governor was in an impossible position, caught between human decency and political reality. But Jake had made his choice and he wasn't backing down. 2 days later, the warriors came. Jake was helping Clayton repair one of the shelter roofs when Vera landed beside them, her scales pale with fear. They're coming. A full delegation from the High Council. Maybe 20 warriors. They're demanding entry to the valley. Jake climbed down from the roof, his heart pounding but his expression calm. Get the children into the back shelters. Keep them safe. Jake, these are trained warriors. They won't do anything, Jake interrupted. Not if we don't let them. He sent out emergency messages to every human volunteer who'd helped over the past weeks. Within an hour they started arriving. Beverly with her medical team. Kyle and Raymond with a dozen other engineers. Patricia and her teaching staff. Farmers, builders, mechanics. People who'd seen what was happening in this valley and decided it mattered. By the time the Drakari warriors landed at the valley entrance, nearly 50 humans stood blocking the path. Unarmed. Unarmored. Just standing there with their arms crossed and absolute determination in their eyes. The lead warrior, the same scarlet-scaled male from before, landed with a ground-shaking thud. His name was Commander Rothgar, and he radiated authority like heat from a furnace. Stand aside, humans. This is Drakari business. No, Jake said simply. Rothgar's eyes narrowed. You have no authority here. The High Council has spoken. These orphans will be removed and dealt with according to our traditions. Your interference ends today. These children aren't going anywhere, Jake said. Behind him, every human volunteer stood firm. Behind them, the Drakari children watched with wide, terrified eyes. Vera stood with them, her body positioned protectively, torn between her species and the humans who'd shown her impossible kindness. You would risk war for this? Rothgar's claws dug into the ground. Your governor has already been informed. Interfere further, and every human on this planet will be expelled. Then expel us, Beverly called out. But you'll have to do it standing over our bodies because we're not moving. The other warriors landed behind Rothgar, 20 of them fully armed. The tension crackled like electricity. Jake could feel his heart hammering, but he kept his expression calm. This was the moment. Either they backed down or everything went to hell. Then something nobody expected happened. One of the warriors, younger than the others, stepped out of formation. His scales were bronze, his horns still relatively short. He walked slowly, deliberately, until he stood beside Jake. I won't do this, the young warrior said, his voice shaking but clear. I won't drag starving children out of the first safe home they've had in months. Not in my name. Not for tradition. Rothgar's expression turned thunderous. Cole, get back in formation. That's an order. Cole, the young warrior, shook his head. No, Commander. Some orders are wrong. For a moment nothing happened. Then another warrior stepped forward. An older female with gray-tinted scales. My daughter was killed in the Krovar invasion, she said quietly. She had 3 hatchlings. If they survived, they'd be in a place like this. Abandoned. Starving. I can't do this either. Then another Drakari stepped forward. Then 2 more. Not warriors but civilians who'd been watching from the cliffs. Elders who'd lost family. Parents who couldn't stomach the thought of children suffering. They came down and stood with the humans, a mixed line of humans and Drakari facing down the warriors. Rothgar's wings spread wide in fury. You're all traitors. Abandoning tradition for... His words cut off as a shadow fell over the entire valley. A shadow so massive it blocked out both suns. Everyone looked up. Every warrior, every human, every Drakari, all turned their eyes skyward. Descending from the clouds was a Drakari larger than any Jake had ever seen. Her scales were deep silver, almost white with age. Her wings spread so wide they could have covered Jake's entire farm. Scars crisscrossed her body, telling stories of battles fought over centuries. This was Matriarch Helena, one of the oldest living Drakari. Jake had heard stories about her. A warrior from the ancient times, a survivor of wars most Drakari only knew from history recordings. She'd been alive for over 300 years. She landed with a boom that shook the ground, and every single Drakari, including Rothgar, immediately lowered their heads in respect. Even the humans felt the weight of her presence. Helena's ancient eyes swept across the valley, taking in everything. The shelters Jake and the volunteers had built. The clinic Beverly had set up. The children watching with a mixture of fear and hope. She looked at the line of humans and Drakari standing together. She looked at Jake. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared. The fate of everything hung in the air, waiting for her judgment. Matriarch Helena moved through the valley with slow, deliberate steps. Every footfall seemed to carry the weight of centuries. Jake watched her, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. This ancient Drakari held all their fates in her claws. One word from her, and everything he'd built here could be torn apart. She walked to the clinic first, where Beverly was treating a young hatchling with a respiratory infection. Helena peered inside, watching as the human doctor gently examined the child, speaking in soft, reassuring tones even though the hatchling probably couldn't understand most of the words. The little one's parent would have spoken Drakari, but Beverly's kindness needed no translation. Helena said nothing. She moved on. She examined the shelters Jake and the volunteers had constructed. Her clawed hand ran along the insulated walls, tested the stability of the support beams. She looked at the water pump system Kyle and Raymond had installed, watched clean water flow into collection barrels. Her expression gave away nothing. Then she walked to the fields where Jake had taught Clayton and some of the older children how to plant crops. Tiny green shoots were just beginning to push through the soil. Rows of vegetables that would feed these children through the winter. Food they wouldn't have to hunt or beg for. Helena stared at those shoots for a long time. She passed a group of children playing with toys Patricia had brought. Human toys, alien to the Drakari children, but they'd figured them out quickly. Their laughter rang through the valley, a sound that had been absent for too long. Helena's ancient eyes watched them play, and something flickered in her expression. Finally she stopped in front of Jake. The old matriarch towered over him, easily 3 times his size. Her silver scales caught the light, each one marked with the scars of battles long past. When she spoke, her voice rumbled like stones grinding together, deep and commanding. "You shame us, human?" Jake felt every eye in the valley turn toward him. He could hear Hrothgar's satisfied grunt behind him. But Jake had come too far to back down now. He met Helena's ancient gaze without flinching. "Good," he said clearly. "Maybe you needed it." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Then Helena's eyes changed. The hardness in them softened, just slightly, replaced by something that might have been respect. Maybe even approval. "You misunderstand me," Helena said, and now there was something almost gentle in her grinding stone voice. "You shame us not because you have done wrong, but because you have shown us what we should have done ourselves. You shame us because we let tradition blind us to cruelty. Because we convinced ourselves that abandoning children was strength, when it was nothing but cowardice dressed in ancient words." She turned away from Jake, addressing the gathered crowd. Warriors, civilians, humans, and Drakari all watched her with held breath. This human saw starving children and did not ask about traditions or sovereignty or cultural differences. He did not form committees or debate philosophy. He simply fed them, sheltered them, taught them how to survive. Helena's voice grew stronger, carrying across the valley. "It took an outsider to show us that we had forgotten the most fundamental truth of any civilization, that true strength means protecting those who cannot protect themselves." Hrothgar stepped forward, his scarlet scales bristling. "Matriarch, with respect, tradition has guided us for thousands of years. We cannot simply—" "Some traditions deserve to die," Helena cut him off, her voice sharp as a blade. "So that our children may live. I watched my own grandchildren starve in the last great famine, 300 years ago, because tradition said the weak must fall. I have carried that shame for centuries. I will not carry it again." She spread her massive wings, the span of them blocking out the sky. "I declare these orphans under the protection of both our peoples, human and Drakari, together. This valley will be recognized as a sanctuary, a place where the old ways end and something better begins. Let any who disagree challenge me now." The silence was absolute. Hrothgar looked like he wanted to argue, but even he wouldn't challenge the matriarch's word. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his head in acceptance. The other warriors followed. Then something beautiful happened. The children, who had been hiding in fear, began to emerge from the shelters. They crept forward cautiously, then with growing confidence. One small hatchling walked right up to Helena's massive foot and looked up at her with wide, hopeful eyes. The ancient matriarch lowered her head and gently touched the child's snout with her own. "You are worthy," she said softly. "You always were." In the weeks that followed, the valley transformed. It became official, recognized by both human and Drakari governments. The first mixed settlement on Drakenheim. More volunteers arrived, both human and Drakari. The warriors who'd challenged them became some of the most dedicated protectors. Vera, the young dragoness who'd started it all by asking for leftover pork, became the valley's leader. She understood both peoples now, could bridge the gap between human practicality and Drakari pride. Under her guidance, the settlement flourished. Jake went back to his farm. He had pigs to feed and a business to run. But he visited the valley at least twice a week, usually bringing supplies or just lending a hand wherever needed. The children knew him now, would run to greet him when he arrived. When the off-world news networks got wind of the story, reporters descended on Drakenheim like locusts. They all wanted to interview the human farmer who'd changed in alien culture. Jake avoided most of them, but one persistent reporter finally cornered him at his barn. "Why did you risk everything for them?" the reporter asked, camera drone hovering nearby. "They weren't your species, your responsibility. You could have been expelled from the planet. Why did you do it?" Jake looked at the reporter like the answer should be obvious. "They were kids. That's reason enough." The reporter pressed for more, wanted some deep philosophical explanation. But Jake just shrugged and went back to work. That was the answer. The only answer that mattered. Months later, on an evening like the one where it all began, Jake was preparing scraps for his compost when he heard wings. But this time Vera didn't land alone. 3 young Drakari were with her, students from the valley who wanted to learn human farming techniques. "Jake," one of the hatchlings called out excitedly. "Vera says you can teach us about crop rotation." Jake grinned. "Sure can. But first you're helping me feed the pigs." As they worked, the smallest hatchling looked up at Jake with curious eyes. "Are all humans like you? Do all of you help people who need it?" Jake thought about that while he scooped feed. "Most of us try our best," he said finally. "We're not perfect. We mess up plenty. But yeah, when we see someone in trouble, especially kids, we're pretty stubborn about helping. Can't just walk away from that. It's not in our nature." "That's weird," the hatchling said thoughtfully. "Yeah," Jake agreed with a smile. "I guess it is. But it's a good kind of weird." The evening air was cool, the twin moons rising over the mountains. In the distance, Jake could see lights from the valley settlement, warm and bright against the darkening sky. Children were safe there. Fed, sheltered, learning, growing. All because someone asked for leftover pork, and a stubborn human decided that wasn't good enough.